echoes beneath the skull, in the quiet village of Oakhaven. 10-year-old Kael lived in a state of perpetual, vibrating caution. To others, a lie was a mere social lubricant or a shield against trouble. To Kael, a lie was a drumbeat. The first time it happened, he had told his mother he hadn't eaten the honey cake. The moment the false no left his lips, a heavy, rhythmic thud crunch echoed inside his cranium. It sounded like a soldier's boot striking packed gravel. It wasn't an external sound. It was a bone conduction tremor that made his vision blur. As Kael grew, so did the walker. A white lie about chores brought a steady pace. A deeper deception brought a frantic, heavy-breathing run that lasted for hours, the phantom footsteps sprinting across the floor of his mind until he confessed. Desperate for relief, Kael's parents brought him to Master Vane, a reclusive scholar who lived in a tower lined with jars of captured echoes. Vane pressed a cold, brass stethoscope to Kael's temple and listened, his eyes widening in academic awe. He claimed Kael was haunted by a Veritas stalker, a rare guardian spirit that fed on the purity of the world. He told the boy that every time he lied, he starved the spirit, causing it to pace its cage in hunger. For years, Kael lived by this rhythm, becoming a beacon of truth whose honesty was so piercing it made him both revered and feared. He never spoke a word that didn't ring true, because the alternative was the agonizing, bone-shaking thunder of the walker in his skull. The crisis came when the ironclad Inquisitors arrived, searching for the traitors who had hidden the village's grain. They lined the villagers up in the square, and Kael stood at the end of the line, his head blissfully silent. He knew where the silos were hidden. He had seen the elders move the grain to the caves behind the waterfall. If he told the truth, the village would starve. If he lied, the village would live, but the walker would likely break his mind. He opened his mouth to lie, to save his people, but the footsteps didn't just start, they exploded. It wasn't a spirit pacing. It was a sound of desperate, frantic struggle. Kael clutched his head, falling to his knees as he heard a voice through the cacophony. It was his own voice, but older, jagged with a century of regret. The spirit was no guardian. As the footsteps reached a deafening crescendo, Kael saw a flash of a different life, a future past. He saw himself as an old man in a timeline where he had been a man of absolute, uncompromising honesty. In that life, he had told the Inquisitors the truth. He had watched the village burn and his family die of hunger while he held his pure tongue. The footsteps were his own. He was the old Kael, a ghost born of a catastrophic mistake, who had spent eternity walking backward through time into his own younger mind. He wasn't there to feed on truth. He was there to warn himself that sometimes a lie is the only thing that holds the world together. The pacing was the restless energy of a man trying to kick down the door of his younger self's conscience. Kael looked up at the Inquisitor, the footsteps in his head turning into a march of defiance. "I have no idea where the grain is," Kael said. Inside his head, the walker stopped. He heard the sound of a man finally sitting down, letting out a long, exhausted breath, and vanishing into a silence of a debt finally paid. The silence that followed the departure of the Inquisitors was not the peaceful stillness Kael had expected. It was a heavy, ringing void. For the first time in his life, the interior of his skull felt cavernous and empty. A house suddenly vacated by a long-term tenant. He stood in the center of the muddy square, the villagers slowly exhaling around him, their lives preserved by the weight of his deception. But as he turned to walk home, a new sensation began to bleed through the quiet. A faint, rhythmic scratching, like a quill moving over parchment, localized just behind his left ear. He realized then that the old Kael hadn't just vanished into nothingness. The act of lying had successfully diverted the timeline, but it hadn't erased the man. The footsteps had stopped because the journey was over, but the ghost remained as a silent witness to the new world he had helped create. Every time Kael looked in a mirror or caught his reflection in a rain barrel, he saw the subtle shift in his own features. The way his eyes now carried a shadow of the exhaustion that had defined his predecessor. He wasn't just Kael anymore. He was a composite, a boy living a life paid for by the ghost of a man who had chosen to fail so that his younger self could succeed. The tension returned weeks later when the village elders gathered to celebrate their miraculous survival. They praised Kael for his bravery, yet as they spoke, the scratching in his head grew into a frantic, jagged scribble. The older voice returned, not as a scream, but as a weary whisper. A lie saves the belly, but it starves the soul in a different way. Now, you must carry the weight of their survival alone. Kael looked at the faces of his neighbors, realizing that they now lived in a reality built on a foundation of mist. He saw the way the elders looked at him, with a touch of fear, knowing that the boy who could lie to an Inquisitor's face could lie to them just as easily. The final twist of his fate revealed itself as he reached adulthood. The scratching eventually turned into the sound of a closing book. Kael realized that his guardian wasn't just a memory of a past life, it was a tether. By choosing to lie, he had severed his connection to the pure world the scholar Vane had described. But he had gained something far more terrifying, the ability to reshape reality through his words. He was no longer a victim of the footsteps. He was the one who decided where the next step would land. He spent the rest of his days as the village's silent protector, a man who spoke very little, for he knew that every word he uttered now vibrated through time, felt by a younger version of himself in 1,000 other timelines. Still listening for the sound of boots on gravel,